Just a few months ago, many of us experienced devastating bushfires, record temperatures, droughts and storms, extreme weather all around. And the debate about the role of climate change on bushfires and droughts ran hot too. It seemed like a different time. Remember that? We're now focused, of course, on COVID-19 and the pandemic. Well, Hot Mess is a new RN series that looks at why, despite decades of science, climate change remains a divisive issue in Australia and why we fail to act quickly enough. Part of the answer lies with us, all of us. Why is it that experiencing extreme weather makes some people think it's made worse by climate change and others think it's normal? Here's episode 1 of Hot Mess with Richard Adey.
Where are you now? I'm just going to take a stab and say home, because that's where you probably are. It's where most people are. And you've probably been there most of the time for more than a month. You'll be getting better at it, but you're also probably still adapting and getting your head around what you've lost. But here's the thing. Depending on where you are, loss, adaptation, even grief started more than half a year ago, in the spring, because of something else.
Catastrophic scenes on the Gold Coast hinterland. The historic Binnaburra Lodge reduced to a smouldering ruin.
It's horrific. It's like a war zone. Catastrophic. No words to describe it. Homes lost up the back of us. Scared, nervous. Kind of want to go home, but can't go home yet. So yeah, just planning on where to go from here.
Holy that's behind me. Malakuta.
We've got 4,000 people on the beach there that are being very well protected by our firefighters.
Residents were told to get in the water when they heard warning sirens. Some decided not to wait.
Everyone's safe and sound. Got the girls and the dogs up the front.
I'm Richard Adey. 2019 was the hottest year on record in Australia. Most of the eastern part of the country has been gripped by drought. The last 3 years has been the driest in the Murray-Darling Basin since we started keeping records. Then there's the Black Summer. You'd think that would convince pretty much everyone that climate change is a thing and that we'd better get on with doing something about it. Every month, the market research firm Ipsos asks 1,000 Australians about their concerns. In January, those concerns were bushfires, smoke, climate change. So time to sort it out, right? Jennifer Brooke from Ipsos.
I think that it would be nice to think that the flip side of a terrible bushfire season such as that we've just endured would be a chance to really galvanise everyone to tackle climate change. But I think that it is a big ship to turn around, and so perhaps it doesn't just change direction overnight or over one bushfire season. I think that perhaps this is the beginning of a moment, but it's going to need sustained work and push from a lot of people.
But we didn't get that. So I spoke to you some weeks ago, and I'm calling you again because things have changed.
Things have changed incredibly, haven't they, since we last spoke? So we have been tracking attitudes towards the coronavirus for the last couple of weeks now. And I think it's safe to say that this is probably what most people in the community are preoccupied with at the moment. The environment, I think, is probably on the back burner, understandably so, as people have very stark concerns for themselves, for their families, loved ones, and for the economy in general.
For me, that moment, when I realised we had to do something, came a long time ago. It's 1994. I'm in London working for the BBC, and around the world, new stories start coming out.
Since their landmark report on the greenhouse effect 4 years ago, the world's top climate scientists have been reviewing the evidence, gathering data and refining computer predictions. 2,500 scientists around the world took a fresh look at whether the burning of oil, gas and coal and the clearing of native vegetation will change the world's climate.
That report came out at the end of 1995. It used a key phrase, the balance of evidence. On balance, the IPCC said, we're warming the planet, and it's because of us. That was enough for me. I thought, surely now, governments, businesses, all of us will have to act. It hasn't turned out that way. I want to know why. That's what Hot Mess, this series, is all about. Now, part of it is businesses that have too much to lose. Think tanks undermining the science, governments too close to fossil fuel industries. And we'll get to all of that. But the problem, the delay, starts with us, with how our brains work. George Marshall is the author of Don't Even Think About It, why our brains are wired to ignore climate change.
Climate change is unfortunately a package that is very adept at getting past our psychological defenses. We're well geared to deal with problems that we have adapted to previously. This is a new kind of problem. You know, we respond very well to things which are here now, where there's an immediate threat, where we can see that there's an enemy and we can see who that is. Climate change, unfortunately, is none of those things.
What it is, what we think it is uncertain, expensive, and in the future.
This is actually the worst possible combination, that when we're dealing with things which are in the future, we tend to postpone them, that involve cost, we tend to avoid them, and that are uncertain, we tend to wait until things are settled and sorted. The danger of climate change is that even when it becomes here and now, and even when it becomes far, far more certain, we keep locked into that state of affairs because we are avoiding the cost.
It shouldn't take you that long to do the experiment. It should be like 10, 15 minutes.
All right, let's go.
I'll shut the door behind you.
Okay. Part of the problem is that most of us really aren't good at assessing risks that are down the track. To prove it, I'm in the psychology lab at the University of New South Wales with Professor Ben Newell.
Okay, so the main aim of the experiment is to see how people make choices under risk and under uncertainty across a sequence of trials, so how their experience builds up and how that affects the choices that they make. It's contextualized as a little micro world where you're deciding whether to live in an area that's got a higher risk of some kind of disaster or a lower risk of some kind of disaster. And what we try to do is say, well, if you want to live in the area that has higher risk, then it can be beneficial. One analogy is you want to live in the house right on the edge of the ocean. You get the really great view most of the time, so you benefit, and in the game you earn more points from living in that place. But you also run the risk of the king tide washing your house away. Whereas if you live in the safer area in the game, in the task, then you earn slightly fewer points, but you have a lower risk of getting that disaster.
Right, so if I go for 10 points there and never have a disaster, or I can go for 15 there, 1, 10 and 100, or I can go for 15 there, which is 1 in 100. I think I'll go for the 1 in 100. Choose a house for this round. I think I'm going to stay where I am. Okay. Oh, it's not again. Oh. Disaster occurred in 9% of locations, but not near me. I'm staying. Still staying. I haven't moved yet. I'm at 227 points.
So what your data show is that when you're in the moderate environment, you did actually, for most of your trials, 95%, you decided to stay in the riskier area. So you decided to stay by the sea, but you didn't lose the house. So you were pretty lucky. You didn't have any disaster. And just on 5% of those trials, you changed and you moved to a safer one.
Oh, new experiment conditions. Yes, so the frequency is low where I am, relatively low, but the severity is high. Do you know what? What I'm going to do is move up here. Oh, do you look super smart now because the house where I used to be, that's gone. That's been hit by a disaster. And where I am, there are no disasters. No disasters there. I feel like a genius. Oh, gee, it's getting smashed, that location I used to be at. 370 points getting smashed again. Whoa, I'm glad I got out of there.
The other figure shows that when we change the environment, and this is indicated on the screen, it says, okay, now things are getting worse, the disasters are getting more severe, that you can switch your strategy and said, okay, I'm going safe now. And 87% of your choices now are in the safe area. Only 13% did you go for any risk at all, the smaller scale risk, and you didn't go to the risky village at all. You were content with not having the view of the ocean anymore.
I've earned 615.5 points.
Because you didn't actually suffer any kind of disaster, you accumulated points all the way and you walked out. And you would have earned 56 cents if you were a participant in that. Normally it would go for longer and you might even earn enough to have a cup of coffee, but in this case it was 56 cents.
Okay, so I was lucky in the first part of the game. It could have been very different. In the second part, I acted like a middle-aged homeowner. But even people like me can't worry about everything. Nobody can. George Marshall.
We manage the amount that we worry about so that we can prioritize, so that we're not paralyzed with being overwhelmed by things. And we particularly like to take on board and tick off things that are done, right, done, out the door, finished. We're particularly bad at dealing with things which are long-term problems, in which case our actual tendency is just to adapt to them and just say, oh, well, that's something over there. And we can see this very clearly, or we have seen this for the last 30 years. When you ask people, are you concerned about climate change? Then the majority of people in every country in the world actually will say yes. But if you ask them, what are you worried about? So you just ask them an open question, very rarely in the past have they mentioned climate change. So that's to say, this is the pool of the things they worry about, and they're keeping climate change thoroughly on the banks of the pool.
That makes sense. For most of humanity's existence, we couldn't be worrying about the future because we were too busy trying not to be killed.
It's easy to run away with evolutionary just so stories, but I think there has to be something in that. That there has been a very long period of time in which we didn't have the luxury, in a sense, of thinking beyond the next meal or the next place of shelter or whatever. And our society, I guess, has developed and built on that more adaptive way of thinking. And it's only now, when we're able to really forecast out what's the impact of our current behaviours, that we have to start to overcome that property that up to now has served us pretty well.
It's left us with what's called a present bias. We put a lot of value on the present and not enough on the future. We all have it, and it's hard to ignore.
One of the reasons that is so difficult is because it is overcoming that behaviour pattern that's treated us so well, and now to overcome that focus on the present, we have to do things which feel aversive now for some potential future benefit that is uncertain, that may not actually be for us personally, it might be for future generations, and that kind of goes against a lot of those ways in which we've behaved up to now.
This is Hot Mess. I'm Richard Adey. I'm wondering how the psychology lines up with how we feel about things. Time to talk to some non-psychologists. Hello?
Yeah, hi mate.
I'm all right.
Now, where do you want to do this? Oh, you go in that room now, wherever you like.
Karen and Alfie are my neighbours. They're in business and they work hard. We've lived next door to each other for 13 years, get on really well, and we've never talked about climate change.
I'm the only one that's been out.
I've been out.
Did you work yesterday? Yeah. Yeah, but I haven't stopped working. But we're all like super essential. Yeah, like we've been keeping washing our hands all the time.
It's definite. There's climate change, and it's a bit too rapid. It does bother me a lot. It really does, but it's also hard to stop doing what you've been doing for a long time.
What do I think about climate change? I do believe there is a form of climate change, but I think that climate has been changing for thousands of years. And like I said,
the human race is probably contributing to it, but going on like what's happening now, can it be turned around this quick? Like we said, the air seems a little bit different outside, less people on the roads in their cars.
It has really shown us, just on a visual level, how much pollution we generate just going about our daily business. And maybe this is something that can stop us from saying, hey, do we actually really need that? Do I need that thing anymore? Why do I need to buy that thing or do that? Because I can survive quite simply without it.
It's a big decision to turn around and say, okay, if we really want to change the climate, and the government turn around and say, okay, we're shutting the coal mines. So what happens to all these people who are working? Where do we put all these people in the coal mines? So it's damned if you do and damned if you don't. So either do we save our environment or do we save the almighty dollar? And that's what it comes down to it. But to shut off the coal industry now, that'd be another disaster in itself. So how we turn that around is the question, I'm not an expert at it.
Do you think last summer was a kind of moment for us on this?
I do think, people, it was a bit of a wake-up call to people, but then there was still the argument of, there's going to be fires anyway. Well, yes, there possibly was going to be fires, but how bad was that? I remember not long before we had our fires, they were going on about how much pollution from the Amazon burning, and that was nothing compared to what Australia did. And, it was bad.
I think we had 2 days here where it was catastrophic.
Yeah.
And on one of those days, I packed the car and I drove down to the station and I parked the car down there because I thought I want to,
Yeah, we packed.
How we feel about danger depends on how close it is. Karen and Alfie and I live 100 metres from the bush. Last spring, on a catastrophic day, part of our valley was on fire. It concentrates the mind much more than something on the other side of the country. This is psychological distancing. We worry less about things we feel are far away, in the future, or uncertain. Climate change can feel like all three, until it comes to your place.
Well, we're between Mackay and Rockhampton, and it runs beef cattle. It was pelleted by my parents back in 1970.
This is Simon Yetta. He's lived on this property most of the time for more than 45 years.
Well, I guess that I've seen a number of things, but the biggest event we had here was on the 29th of March back in 2017. It was Cyclone Debbie that came down the coast and caused a massive flood, the likes that I would never have imagined in my wildest dreams. Came through our house, our high-blocked house, came half a metre into the second story, eclipsed the last record here by over 5 metres. Yeah, it was just totally surreal and quite devastating.
Simon's place is hilly when the stock were fine, but there was plenty of damage and a lot of cleaning up. It had quite an impact.
I guess it was a light bulb moment that, that's what the scientists have been telling us, that our weather events are becoming more extreme, and at the back of my mind I thought, it probably will never happen to us. It, happens in other countries and, in other places, but I guess that was the moment that it was totally cemented in my mind that man-made climate change was real.
Around Simon's way, it's not something you really say, but it stopped him.
Well, I've done a number of radio interviews. Also, I had my face on a postcard that went out into, I think it was 100,000 mailboxes, before the last election, just talking about fossil fuels and through farmers for climate action. I haven't had that much feedback. People tend to not come out with what they really think. It's a bit like coming out, I guess, when it comes to humans interfering with the climate.
So everybody knows your position, but nobody wants to talk to you about it. Is that it?
No, not really. When I sometimes mention my position around here, the eyes glaze over a bit. I don't really want to go there, so I don't push it.
To me, it's not surprising that a cyclone dumping a devastating amount of rain on your property could prompt you to accept that what we're doing is causing climate change. But that isn't what always happens.
There's a lot of problems with how we cope with extreme weather events. One of the things I did in my book was I went and interviewed people who had been through extreme weather events and talked to them about their relationship to climate change and trying to understand if that had changed. And it was pretty clear that it had not changed. People who believed in climate change had become more so. People who didn't were just as likely to dismiss it as they had before. Part of the challenge of climate change is it comes in the form of extreme weather. And although on the one hand that should be something that would shock and stimulate us into change, it's something that as humans we are very well adapted to. An extreme weather event comes through, and first of all we are well skilled at dealing with it. And remember, it's usually something which is in a place that has had that kind of weather before. It's just more so. So it's more bushfire, it's more drought, or it's more flood. We come together, so we start to feel collectively quite strong about working together. So we really don't want to bring up climate change, which is a bit divisive. And we go into a coping and recovery mode where we deal with the problem, we're a bit traumatized by it, we go into recover, we restore, we renew, we rebuild. We then get ready to move on with our lives. Nothing in this coping cycle allows the space within which you can say, but you know what? This is actually because of a much bigger problem and it's going to get worse, because part of coping is not actually wanting to face up to the fact that this is something that will get worse and worse and worse.
Which all makes sense, right? But I still think living through an extreme weather event would make me more likely to think it was climate change. But that's because of a bias I have. You have it too. We all do.
I seek out information that conforms with what I'm currently thinking, or I'm more likely to assimilate things that fall into my worldview. I'm not challenged as much. And you can roll into that things like availability bias, how readily I can bring up instances of things. Well, I probably bring up instances of things that fit with my worldview because I've gone through this process of confirmation seeking. Representativeness is another one of the classic biases, which just says that I judge things in terms of their similarity with other things that I think are in that class of events. And again, you can bring in availability, memory, and confirmation to that. So they're all something to do with the way that we seek out and represent information and search for information, either in our own heads or through the environment in front of us.
This is Hot Mess on RN, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Richard Adey. And we were talking about confirmation bias, seeking out opinions you already agree with. I don't agree with.
My name is Paul. I live in the area. I have an engineering background, and I work for an engineering company in Sydney. So I'm...
Full disclosure, Paul's a friend. We've had a few arguments about this, but he doesn't deny that the climate's changing.
I can read the data, so I'm definitely aware that over the last 50 years, looking back to maybe the late 70s, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, they've seen a significant amount of warming. When I was a 6-year-old kid back in the Netherlands, I used to dig out the car of my dad, together with my dad, in 1.5 meters of snow. That won't happen nowadays. So there's definitely enough incredible data and observations out there that tell you, yes, the world, particularly the Northern Hemisphere, has warmed.
What Paul isn't convinced of is that we're heading for catastrophic change, because he doesn't think the computer models are up to scratch.
The models, and all of this is a result of modeling, in general predicts too much warming. Some of the important mechanisms in the models are not well understood or are not well represented in the models. Clouds are not sufficiently well modeled, and I think they're a primary effect in climate change, primary driver. Ocean cycles are insufficiently taken into account in the global circulation models.
Warnings of a catastrophic fire in Sydney had been made loud and clear, and late this afternoon, South Tarramurra was ablaze. Embers lighting up bushland in the valley east of Beecroft.
So last summer, bushfires quite near here, actually. I remember bumping into you the next day, and then somebody had started one a few blocks from
away. Yeah, indeed.
Did that make you think, well, hang on, maybe this climate change is driving these effects, and maybe I shouldn't be so relaxed about it?
That's a good question. One of the main contributors to fire is the amount of precipitation, or the lack thereof, you have in a drought. And if you look at longer term precipitation trends in this country, 10, 20, 30 years, you can't see a climate change trend in precipitation. Not a clear one.
So George Marshall's right. For me, the fires confirmed that climate change is a real danger, and for Paul, they didn't. It's not the only thing we differ on.
Look, I probably feel I'm slightly right of centre, so a little bit more to the conservative side rather than to the progressive side. I agree with some of, let's say, the basics of the conservative view of the world. A good government is the smallest possible government. I think that's an important conservative view. So posing the unbridled growth of government, which we also see in Australia, unfortunately, I think the importance of taking responsibility of your own acts, that's a very important pillar under conservatism, and those I definitely support.
That gets us to something else, something that's crucial in what all of us believe: identity. Winifred Lewis is at the University of Queensland.
Some people would say it's a profound source of all that we believe. So if you think about how you move around in the social world, you're exposed to millions or thousands of messages, and you choose to believe the ones that are relevant to you, that are trustworthy, and the foundation for that judgment of relevance and trust is who you are.
With every identity, and we all have several, comes what psychologists call norms.
Yeah, these norms are social rules or standards, and the idea is that they affect not just our behavior, like when we get married or how many children we have, but also our beliefs, like what do we think is important in politics, what do we think is true in the world. And so if you think about climate change, an issue is that almost everyone believes in climate change and the human agency. But still, if you look at the proportion of people that think it's time to act now, it's much higher in some, say, political groups than in some others. It's higher in certain areas of the country than in some others. And so those belief norms, or norms about what we should believe, what we do believe, are more important than people think. And the whole operation of identities and norms in psychology is usually understood to be unconscious. They guide how we relate to the world without us having to think to ourselves, oh, now I'm a journalist and therefore I will believe this or that.
So this stuff's just sort of ticking over,
yeah,
and we're not really conscious of it.
That's right. It's like the software in the background that helps us to filter the world.
When it comes to where you are on climate change, one identity is more important than the others.
If you look at what political party people are voting for, that's a strong predictor of what they're going to say about climate change and the need to act. Having said that, though, it's the case in Australia that a majority of both the major political parties believe that it's time to act on climate change now, but there's just a difference in prioritization, and sometimes a difference in funding or strategy of the way forward.
But as soon as you have two sides, you get something called expressive responding.
Expressive responding is when people choose an option not because it's what they believe, but because they want to express support for their side.
Neil Levy's a professor of philosophy at Macquarie University, And he says the best example of this came from a couple of American researchers.
What they did is they showed their participants photos of the Trump inauguration and the Obama inauguration. And if you've seen those photos, if you remember them, they're very strikingly different. And then they asked their participants which one depicts the bigger crowd. They didn't tell them what they were photos of, they just relied on people to recognize them, which I'm sure many did. And they asked them which one's a bigger crowd. And 15% of Trump supporters, self-proclaimed Trump supporters, said the photo of the Trump inauguration depicted a bigger crowd, which it clearly did. Now, it's not very plausible that they really looked at that photo and saw a bigger crowd. It's much more likely they said, stuff you. I want to show I support this guy, and I'm going to, as they say, own the libs by expressing this.
It's not just identity, who and what you think you are, it's what that means for who you trust.
I think trust should be seen as part of the rational process. If you tell me something, whether I believe you should be very strongly responsive to whether I trust you. Are you trying to exploit me by getting me to do something that's not in my interests? Or are you incompetent? So I shouldn't trust your word because you're not likely to be right. When it comes to really politicized issues that key into our identity, issues which may require us to pay a cost, at least in the short term, trust is absolutely crucial. And it's not just an irrational influence, it actually should influence how we respond.
We have an appointment to see the mayor.
Oh, right, okay. What time is your appointment?
10:30, we're a bit early. So what does all this mean if your identity is someone who's part of a coal community? How do you see climate change? Is it something you talk about? To find out, I've come to visit Sue Moore. She's the mayor of Singleton in the Hunter Valley. Hello, nice to meet you. I'm Richard.
Hello, Richard.
This is Belle, Linda. So, how much is climate change an issue for people in your community?
I don't actually know what the people in our community are feeling regarding climate change, so I'm not really across what I would be comfortable to comment in that aspect.
Is it a hard thing to talk to other people about?
It's not something we talk about. It's not something the community has an appetite to talk about.
I mean, you're surrounded by coal mines here, and it's thermal coal, and 90% of the coal in the Hunter is exported. Coal is sort of being discussed, but are you saying it's not being discussed here?
Well, the climate change is not being discussed here, and that's the question you asked. Coal is very much still part of this area, Singleton, Muswellbrook area. We are very reliant on coal, and the market will determine when coal ceases in our area, not us as a council or any given person.
How big is it? What's it worth to the community? Do you have any coal?
Look, not offhand. I know Singleton contributes the significant part or the major part of royalties to the state government, so we're the largest producer of coal, obviously, in New South Wales.
How many mines are there in your area?
I think there's 17 mines in the Singleton LGA.
And there are more, possibly more coming?
Well, there's more extensions being proposed. There's, of course, no more greenfield sites in our LGA, but there's significant extensions that are still on the agenda or yet to be determined by the state government.
I want to ask about climate change. I don't know what you're going to say.
Okay.
Do you believe in climate change?
I believe the climate's changing. The climate's been changing for millions of years.
So do you believe that what we're doing is changing it faster?
I don't think so. I don't know, but I don't think so. I haven't seen anything that demonstrates to me that it is. That's my personal feeling.
Now, don't get me wrong. There are people trying to do something about the gigantic worldwide problem that is climate change. They're making a difference, and you'll meet a few of them later in the series. But there is this problem with us getting our heads around it, and partly this is because of our identities, who we are. That's our politics, the communities we're part of, what we do, dozens of other things. What they add up to shapes how we see the world and what we believe. We also have biases. We privilege the present, discount the future, and we tend to seek out information that confirms what we already think. All of which explains a lot about why we've done so little to do with climate change. But it doesn't explain all of it. Coming up next time on Hot Mess, how industries and think tanks pushed our buttons and got the delay they wanted.
The meeting was held at the headquarters of the Competitive Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and they came up with a global strategy to defeat Kyoto, and it was agreed that Australia would be a key to that.
I came home, I showed it to my wife and my kids, and it really struck me at that moment that 50 years ago, the coal industry was understanding pretty clearly what they were contributing to. They didn't make a decision to do nothing. They made a decision to actively deny.
Climate denialism or climate skepticism drives subscriptions to Australian. It drives subscriptions to Sky. There's a big audience out there for News Corp who love them saying this stuff. So I think commercially it plays well for them. Hot Mess is produced by Belinda Summer. Script input from Sophie Townsend and Joel Werner. Our sound engineer is Russell Stapleton. I'm Richard Adey.
And yes, we'll hear more episodes of Hot Mess in the weeks to come. It is coming up to 8:45 on Sunday Extra. Julian Morrow with you in just a second.
Julian Morrow, married to my cousin's daughter. True fact. Bet you didn't know that. Cousin Globetrotter, I call his mother-in-law. She was a chartered accountant when she was something like 16 or 17. Been around a bit. She's even camped in my front yard. But anyway, my total lifetime carbon footprint is somewhat lower than hers. Such is life. I thought that was very interesting. It was kind of boring at the start with his lead up, with his tedious illustration of game theory and his own mindset, but it all tied in very well. And yeah, he's right. Confirmation bias and Dunning-Kruger effect. They didn't seem to mention that the less somebody knows about a specialised topic, the more they feel they're experts in that field, specifically because everything they know about it is something they've thought up for themselves. I knew a bloke once who had a brilliant brain fart. He wanted to be able to wear a parachute harness connected to a balloon that would be maybe a metre by 2 metres by a metre in a kind of a blob vertically above him. And he wanted to have a 2-stroke motor on the bottom of the backpack and a balloon hanging on the top of it. And he wanted to have some new high-tech gas that would be much lighter than hydrogen, because he didn't want to have a great big whole Hindenburg-sized blimp over his head. He wanted to be able to roar around a couple of feet off the ground, in and out through the trees. And he was so primevally innocent and naive of all things chemical that he didn't understand that there is no gas that's lighter than hydrogen. It's number one. It's the first element on the periodic table. It is the lightest atom molecule. You can't get a gas that's lighter than hydrogen. there's a lot of people who are kind of deeply invested in this debate upon human behaviour and whether or not humanity is changing the climate. And they don't know anything about it. They don't know that the normal range of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is between 180 and 280 parts per million. They don't understand that when humanity started burning coal in steam engines in the 1700s, we were already sitting on about 270 parts per million, 250 parts per million, or something. I don't know what it was off the top of my head, but we're at 415 parts per million at the moment. It was 300 parts per million when I was born in 1961. I can remember people getting head up as we were going through 385 parts per million, because that was kind of like the lowest possible limit of absolutely catastrophic global warming, climate change. And that was like 15 years ago, something like that. I think it was 20. 20 as they were working up to it, and then 15 as we punched through it. There are people who condemn me for daring to mention that if Reagan and Gorbachev had nuked the world in 1984, then 55% of all of the carbon, the fossilised carbon that humanity has dug out of the ground and injected into the sky would still be safely underground, and global warming would have ended 9 years ago, because it takes 25 years for a cubic metre or a cubic foot or a cubic yard or a cubic furlong of carbon dioxide to achieve all of the warming, or 95% of the warming, that it's going to perform. So you let go a cubic metre in 1995 and it's now finished doing its bit of global warming. So this current, I expect it'll be a hotter than ever previous summer in the Northern Hemisphere, because they just had a hotter than ever previous winter. And the forecast, the Bureau of Meteorology's forecast for this part of Australia is for a hotter than average winter, and we might get average rain if we're lucky. But all of the people who are saying, oh, you better go and order yourself a ton of coal because you're going to get snowed on. Yeah, there was no snow here. No snow within hundreds and hundreds of miles here. There was some snow on the top of the Snowy Mountains. But compared to the Arctic blasts that we used to get once every 10 years, you know, or thereabouts, or less, you know, in 1956, I've seen the photos. 1964, I played in the 3 foot of snow that landed in Glen Innes and took a week to melt. My sister made a snowman for me. I was 3 years old. In 1974, because of the OPEC oil crisis, the boarding school in Armidale I was attending was undergoing a cash shortfall. They sent us home for the first ever home weekend in the middle of the winter term that they'd ever had. While I was home in Glen Innes, 3 feet of snow lay on the ground for a week, communications cut. The Sydney kid who'd come home with me got stuck with me and my parents in Glen Innes in an uninsulated house with 3 foot of snow on the ground. Back in the days when frost used to be on the windows, your own breath condensed on the window pane and then frozen there. 1984, I just worked 10 consecutive night shifts at the Vegetable Creek Hospital. I was in Glen Innes. My mother was in the Lawrence Street house. She was working as a casual school teacher at the high school. And my car was in to have its heater fitted. It was a 1960 FB Holden, and when my father bought it as an accessory in a cardboard box, he'd bought the heater that went with it. And he'd never ever got around to fitting it because, you know, he had an overcoat and fur-lined mittens. I, driving around the district in 1984 in winter, decided to have the heater fitted. And yeah, 3 foot of snow lay on the ground for a week. Lots and lots of people got their sheep killed by shearing in winter or leaving them in places where they became part of a snowdrift. I couldn't get back to Emerville to go back to work after the 4 days rostered off you get every 10 days of night duty. 1994, we might have got 18 inches. 2004, perhaps 6 inches. 2014, people drove from bloody Grafton, come up at 100 miles up the hill to show their children 3 inches of snow lying on the ground. Anybody who says that global warming is not happening is not paying attention. When I was in high school, they took us on a geography excursion to a place called Robertson, south of Sydney, top of the escarpment. It gets a fog nearly every afternoon as the sea breeze pushes the moist, humid air up against the cliff, and it comes up to the top of the cliff and forms a fog. In that fog, there's 5 acres of remnant temperate rainforest living on the fog. When whitefellas showed up there, the whole countryside was covered with temperate rainforest and got a lot of rain, and it had this rich red soil. So they cut down all of the rainforest and they put in dairy farms. And it took 60 years after they cut the trees down for the rainfall to stabilise at 40% of what it used to be, and there didn't grow enough grass to run the cows, and other things happened. And yep, they grow potatoes at Robertson now because they got enough fog to generate the rainfall to keep their little remnant of forest alive. Around here, the last licence for extracting cedar from the rainforest expired in 1963. And in the 1950s, there used to be so much rain, they used to have little cement concrete footpaths for the school kids to line up on, waiting for their school buses. They had to have a boarding house in town for the high school kids because they often couldn't get across the bridges over the gullies to get home to the farms, and it would interrupt their studies. So yeah, they had a boarding house in town because of the frequency of the rain that used to flood the place, flash floods on top of the hills. That doesn't happen. It wasn't happening by the time I was in high school. I watched human effect on the climate just caused by people with axes and hand saws turning into chainsaws and bulldozers during my childhood and adolescence. In 1984, I first read X, the Unknown Factor, which was a collection of science stories by a fellow called Isaac Asimov, who had a PhD in chemistry, and he lectured in biochemistry at a medical college. You know, like he was a kosher scientist, so forgive the pun. And he laid out the case for worrying about carbon dioxide emissions. And he put it up against the success that humanity had had with ozone emission, hole eating chlorofluorocarbons. And he said that perhaps, we should do something about it and we should worry about it. But, I read that in 1984 or 85. And at the time, my big concern was trying to outlive NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. And I didn't think we needed to worry about global warming because industrial civilization was going to nuke itself. The overriding concern was to try not to get killed while all the industrialists went away. Squabbling for market share, I think, and resource pool domination. But yeah, they didn't do that. And the plan has been ever since to grow the economy by growing the human population and applying marketing jism in order to make the share price index rise so that the people who own the shares via their superannuation funds can count on retiring fat and rich and happy on anywhere from 50 to, if you listen to Paul Keating, Australia's ex-Labor Prime Minister, he wants 85% of your working final wage to retire on, and that's all to be funded by the labours of subsequent generations, people who come after and have to eke out a living in a much more impoverished environment because Keating's generation made such a mess of what their grandparents left for them, who made a mess of what their grandparents left for them, etc., 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 going back 12,300 years to the start of the broadacre agro-cultive harvest everythingism, which began at Göbekli Tepe in what is now southeastern Turkey. You know, we live at the point in time where, because we wanted to consume everything to grow the economy, we've got to the point where the entrepreneurs have gone out to net horseshoe bats and bring them back and keep them in a cage, and they didn't know, and therefore they didn't think it was important because of Dunning-Kruger effect and confirmation bias. They didn't know that a healthy bat has some virus, not much. Bat's not sick, the virus is happy living there. As the bat gets stressed, tired, overfed, its immune system becomes suppressed and its viral load increases. So by the time the entrepreneurs go out and use nets to capture a cave full of bats and put them in a cage and transport them and keep them in your wet market beside the pangolins that got trapped on the same or a different expedition, these bats are pretty highly stressed, the ones that are still alive, and they're full of virus. So then when somebody says they want a dozen bats and you break their necks to kill them and you singe them over a candle flame to get, or a gas flame to get rid of the hair, and you open up their belly and you pull out their guts. And what do you do with the guts if you're a bat seller in Wuhan or in a wet market anywhere in Asia where they have wet markets for wildlife? You don't throw the guts away. You've got to feed the pangolins till somebody wants to come and buy a pangolin. You know how much it costs for a bucket of ants in the middle of a city of 11 million people? You throw the bat guts to the pangolin, and the pangolin eats the bat guts and picks up the bat virus. And out of all of the millions of viruses that go into the pangolin, there's one or so that can live in a pangolin. And then they have a bit of a mutation to live in a pangolin. And then somebody else comes along and wants to buy a pangolin. And a pangolin's apparently a scaly anteater that lives on the forest floor in Asia. Sacred animal, you know, but yeah, Chinamen eat them. And they want the pangolin. So you take the pangolin and you cut its throat and it sprays pangolin blood in the air. And I'm assuming you have to breathe a droplet of pangolin blood in order to get the bat pangolin hybrid virus onto your mucous membrane, or perhaps swallow while you get pangolin blood on your lips. Aerosol droplet size, you don't need a lot of it. And then somebody goes from that market out into Wuhan, walks around, talks to various people. They're contagious, maybe they're asymptomatic, but they mix with other people who go to the market, other people are at the market, and it's the people in the market who form the first cluster, apparently. So the story goes. I was hearing about it in December, and by January at the latest, I was talking to my son and expressing concern about how we're going to go if you have to fight fire while you've got pandemic pneumonia that's coming out of China because they've got this cluster and nobody knows what's happening and they haven't shut the airlines down. The bat eater's lament virus is the response of the ecology of the biosphere to the pressure that Homo sapiens sapiens during the Plasticine has been putting on the environment. The Congolese fruit bat tried with Marburg virus and they tried with Ebola, and we cope with that. There's been bird flu, there's been MERS, there's been Hendra virus from the Australian fruit bats. We finally annoyed the little insectivorous bats, the horseshoe bats. And yeah, they've let loose with a virus that it seems like you might only get 3 to 6 months immunity from it, from having a bout of it. So if you can expect it again next year. It's already caused the greatest reduction in carbon emissions since before the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989. And because the entire world economy was barely breaking even and making a profit when everybody was working as hard as they could, as fast as they could, all the marketing jism was go, 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 go. Everybody was happily borrowing money, i.e. spending next year's harvest in order to have a holiday now, or a new car, or a new house, or a whatever. All of the people who were lending them the money were effectively spending the earnings years in advance because they're counting on it and they've borrowed against that income. The whole thing had a momentum and a head of steam, and it was going forward no matter what. Okay, all of a sudden, because everybody is afraid of a pandemic pneumonia that seems to have a 7% mortality rate of everybody who gets diagnosed. Forget about the asymptomatics and the spreaders and all the rest of it. If you get sick enough that you go to the doctor and they say you've got the virus, you're going to have a 7% overall mortality rate. 90% of the people who die are over 60. 54% of the people who need hospitalisation, the average age of people needing hospitalisation is 54. 2 men for every woman needs hospitalisation. Once they get into hospital, the men and the women have got the same death rate as, how many men die out of men sick, how many women die out of women sick. Yeah, they got an equal death rate once they get in, but 2/3 of the people who need to go into hospital are men. 90% of the dead are over 60. Average age of people needing hospitalisation is 54. Yeah, there are people as young as 20 who are dying from it. But this virus kind of seems to be specialised in the older people. Whether you're old and rich or old and poor, if you're old and you get this, you're going to have problems, especially if you're already sick. And it's in the rich societies where you get people living an extended time as an old, unwell person. If you're in a poor society with no healthcare, when you get your first geriatric illness, it's probably going to be your last geriatric illness. In Europe, in America, pretty sure they've got lots of people who are over 65, i.e. they're geriatrics, and they're kind of unwell. So yeah, once you get more than 500 new cases a day in a civilization where you've got all these old, unwell people, you're going to have an exponential growth, and that's what they've had, and that's what they've still got in America, because they're now threatening to shoot at shopkeepers who require you to wear a mask to go into your shop because freedom, Second Amendment. I think it's got a lot to do with the fact that when Trumpy decided that you can wear a mask, but he didn't want to, just before oil became minus $37 a barrel on the futures market for West Texas crude, because people had bought the futures contract to receive oil and they didn't actually own an oil tank because they planned on selling that contract on to somebody else, and nobody else wanted to buy the oil because nobody's burning any oil. Because the Wuhan horseshoe bat pays close attention to Greta Thunberg, and the virus that lives in its guts, it pays really close attention to Extinction Rebellion and the fact that unless something stops the human global economy of the vile age, the global vile age, the 250 years since Captain Cook started shooting at Aborigines, unless something stops us from putting fossil fuels into the sky, then life on planet Earth is kind of headed for where Venus is now, i.e. none, nothing, zilch, existential crisis for the whole planet. If you go back through any of my old videos, you'll see I've been banging on about the fact that 10,000 years ago, humanity and all its pets and livestock was less than 1.5% of all the animal biomass of vertebrates on the land area of the planet. We're now 98.5. 98.5% of everything with a backbone that's living on the surface of the earth, except in the ocean, it's us, it's people, it's our sheep and our cats and dogs and goats and cows and chooks and llamas and donkeys. And yeah, what's left of the biosphere has decided that something has to thin us out to make room for everything else that is necessary to maintain the homeostasis mechanisms that maintain conditions necessary for life to exist on the earth. You can call it the creator God theory of the entire universe, or you can call it the Gaia hypothesis, or you can call it the mathematics of biology. But we didn't know of the presence or the importance of the interlinkings in the biosphere before we started merely dismantling them for profit, for hire, for reward, and sometimes for the fun of it. Now, what else can you call burning fossil fuel to drive in competition to see who can go faster in a circle, travelling nowhere? Or racing horses instead of motor cars, especially when the horses you're going to race get carted all over the countryside in diesel burning trucks, or sometimes flown around the world in kerosene burning airliners so that the horse can go and race in Tokyo or in New Zealand or in England. I mean, the decadent frivolity with which we have become accustomed to burning fossil fuel, it's kind of mind-buggering when you think about it. I'm kind of glad I hurt my back in 1986 and had to stop nursing, because that meant I stopped having access to easy money to spend on hobbies, like going on holidays and stuff like that. I'm kind of glad that I broke my aeroplane and it broke me in 1992, because, I have driven around the countryside in pursuit of hang gliding and aero towing launching events and stuff like that. But I haven't spent any resources on repairing my sky chariot. I haven't paid to buy the fuel so I could go up there and make lawnmower noises in the sky, fulfilling my Biggles fantasies. I can feel virtuous about some of the stuff that I haven't done, although it was probably in my power to do it. One of the things that I thought about and I didn't do was become a violent ecological defender, a saboteur, working against industrial civilization, because I figured that all that would achieve would getting one shot by the police and or incarcerated permanently in the legal system. I don't mind society's desire to take me out of circulation, but if so, I'll have that happen on my terms. Therefore, I live on an endangered species sanctuary. But I feel pretty pleased with myself at this point in time to have contributed as little as possible to the anthropogenic global warming, which is a bigger threat to life on Earth than anything else that's happening at the moment. And it's been so all of my life. This coronavirus, well, pretty soon in America, when their death rate has another jump because of all this obstruction to the social distancing, they're going to get to the point where they regard any stranger as a zombie, somebody who's going to try and kill them by sneezing on them. And that's when their Second Amendment problems are going to become really, really catastrophic. It's the only way to describe it. In Britain, they've suddenly admitted that they were fudging their death figures. They weren't telling you how many people had died at home or in nursing homes. So they had a sudden bump. In the excited status of Norte Americano, they sort of went a bit quiet on the historical analogy about 3 days before they admitted it. But eventually they had to admit the fact that Donald Trump, through his ignorance, his arrogance, his hubris, his malice administration, has killed more American citizens than Prissy Dunce Johnson with his Gulf of Tonkin dolphin incident where he pretended they were communist torpedoes attacking, was it the Maddox? USS Maddox, a destroyer? Even though he knew they were dolphins because, you know, the correction from the captain of the destroyer telling SINCPAC in Hawaii that no, they weren't torpedoes, the midshipman made a mistake. That was on the desk in the Pentagon and in the White House 15 minutes after the initial notification that they were North Vietnamese torpedoes arrived. And yeah, he went ahead with telling the world that the North Vietnamese had attacked his bloody naval boat, you know, exercising freedom of navigation 12 miles off the coast of North Vietnam. Can you imagine if the North Vietnamese had put a bloody destroyer 12 miles off the coast of Baja, California? He would have shit himself. Instead of that, he commenced the American shooting in the Vietnam War. Gulf of Tonkin incident. It started the Vietnam War and Nixon continued on with the bullshit. 56,000 Americans died in the Vietnam War. I used to think it was 55,000. But anyway, by the time the death toll from COVID in America was punching through 58 or 60,000, that's when they admitted, yes, more Americans have died from coronavirus than died in the 10 years of the Vietnam War. So Trump is now trying to blame it on a Chinese germ warfare lab because he doesn't want to admit that nobody did this to America but him. Yeah, he stopped the Chinamen from flying into America, but all of the American cases came from Italy and Germany and England. He's desperate to get his economy up and going again because he knows the longer it sits there, the longer people eat into their savings, the more the likelihood that if and when they try to restart airline travel in the excited status or international airline travel, where are the fat, rich cash cow foreign tourists going to come from who are going to patronise the airlines to get to any of the tourist resorts, which are hoping for them to reappear? I don't think those airliners they've grounded are ever going to fart kerosene fumes into the environment ever again. Those days are over. But that's just a guess. That's just a guess. It's remarkable that here in Australia, when they ordered the lockdown and businesses started to shut, one of the first things they did was they raised the level of the unemployment benefits from $480 a week to about, a fortnight, to about $958 a fortnight, which is the same as the pension. They effectively admitted that the dole was designed to starve people off the dole into work, and the pension is designed as the minimum amount that you can actually live on. So all the dole bludgers have now become pensioners. And then they offered $1,500 a fortnight to any employer who would restrain himself from firing their employees, keep them on the payroll during the lockdown. That's all being done by the government printing money. They say they're going to revert to normal after 6 months. I don't know whether there's going to be the political stomach to do that. I think they're going to keep on printing money and we're just going to go into an inflationary period. But all of the people who thought that it was really important to fly halfway across the country to watch a football team play a game, yeah, they can forget it. That's just not going to happen anymore. People who thought that they could charge $500 a plate for a gourmet meal in a high-end restaurant, they can forget that too. The global vile age is coming to an end. And I'm just amazed at how slowly and gently the beginning has been. No mushroom clouds on the horizon, although Trumpy might be able to fix that. He wants it to be China's fault, you see. If he can convince himself it's China's fault, then you never know. Maybe he'll decide to nuke the buggers to teach them a lesson. Or to eliminate the 60% of America's foreign debt that China holds the chits on. You never know. But anyway, next week there will be part 2. And once again, I'll see what I can do about recording it. Warbles idle at the YouTube. Happy Sunday morning rant. Ciao.